She thought no one would dare challenge her. After all, she'd been the queen bee of the neighborhood for years, doling out fines, dictating rules, and walking like she owned every front yard on the block. But what she didn't count on was that the quiet woman next door, the one who wore soft cardigans, baked cinnamon bread, and waved at every passing car, would be the one to draw the line. Margaret Hayes wasn't loud. She didn't shout, didn't threaten, didn't storm into HOA meetings with a folder full of complaints. But she had something that, once tested, proved stronger than power, louder than titles, and deeper than any rulebook: dignity. And when that dignity was poked, prodded, and pushed too far, even the most patient soul must make a choice. This story isn't about revenge. It's not about yelling matches or legal battles. It's about the quiet strength of one woman who decided that her peace, her space, and her self-respect were worth standing up for. So if you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever bitten your tongue one too many times, or if you've ever wondered whether choosing grace over drama is still worth it, then stay with me. Because what happened on a quiet street in suburban Florida will remind you that sometimes the biggest stand begins with the smallest whisper: no more. Margaret Hayes wasn't born into wealth, and even after marrying into it, she never let money define her. At 58, she still did her own grocery shopping every Saturday, carefully picking out fresh vegetables, running her fingers over strawberries to check for ripeness. She preferred baking to takeout, and she believed there was nothing more comforting than the soft scent of cinnamon drifting through the kitchen in the late afternoon. Her husband, Richard Hayes, was a retired tech entrepreneur, once the founder of a wildly successful software company. These days, he spent most of his time reading old spy novels, tending to his rose garden, and teasing Margaret about how she always managed to get flour on her nose. They'd moved into the Oakview Estates community 3 years ago, a gated suburban enclave with pristine sidewalks, manicured hedges, and a homeowners association with rules for everything from mailbox color to wind chimes. To outsiders, it was an image of quiet luxury: wide lawns, white fences, and the soft hum of sprinklers at dusk. But Margaret didn't care much for appearances. To her, a home wasn't about square footage or zip code. It was about laughter in the hallways, peace in the heart, and a front porch swing where she could sip sweet tea and listen to the birds. She didn't wear flashy jewelry. Her silver-streaked hair was brushed into a neat bun, never dyed. Aging, she'd often say, is a privilege, not a problem. Neighbors knew her as the kind one, the woman who waved at every passing jogger, remembered kids' names and birthdays, and once baked banana bread for the couple down the block after their dog passed away. But that same gentleness, the calm voice, the soft step, made some people underestimate her, especially Blo Vanderholt. Blay was the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA board, always dressed in pastel suits, heels clicking across driveways like she was walking into a courtroom. Her smile was polished, her words perfectly sweet, but her presence was sharp and exacting. She viewed the neighborhood not as a community, but as something to control, and anyone who didn't match her curated vision of perfection was either a project or a problem. At first, Margaret didn't mind. She believed everyone was different, and that a little patience went a long way. After all, being neighborly sometimes meant letting things go. But what Margaret didn't know was that the line between kindness and being taken advantage of is thinner than most people realize. And soon that line, her line, was about to be crossed. It started with a car, a sleek silver Lexus, immaculately clean, parked neatly but unmistakably in Margaret's driveway. The first time, she thought little of it. It was a Tuesday afternoon, mid-October, still warm enough for iced tea. Margaret had just returned from the nursery with 2 pots of chrysanthemums when she saw the Lexus sitting there, as if it belonged. She paused, puzzled. Maybe a delivery? A guest of the neighbors? A mix-up? These things happened, especially in communities where houses looked a bit too alike and driveways too close together. Margaret, ever the optimist, chose grace over annoyance. She parked along the curb and went about her afternoon without giving it another thought. But the next week, it happened again. Same car, same spot. Only this time, it was there when she arrived home from visiting her niece across town. Her own driveway, blocked again. Still, she said nothing. Instead, she left a kind note on the windshield. Hi there. I believe this might be a mistake. This is a private driveway. Kindly park in your own space. Thanks so much. Margaret Hayes. The next day, the car was gone. But the following Wednesday, it returned. This time, Margaret waited until early evening, then walked next door to the stately White House, trimmed with hydrangeas, Blee Vanderholt's home. She knocked twice. The door opened with a soft whoosh of air conditioning, and there stood Bully in a crisp lavender blouse, pearl earrings gleaming. "Oh, Margaret," Belle said with a smile too practiced to be real. "Was that your note on the car?" "Yes," Margaret said gently. "I just noticed it's been parked in our driveway a few times now." Blee waved a manicured hand like she was shooing away a fly. "Oh, I was just running something inside real quick. Hope that's not a big deal. There's never any street parking when my sister visits." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. Margaret nodded slowly, unsure how to respond. "Well, I'd appreciate it if it doesn't happen again," she said, still polite, still steady. "Of course, dear," Blee replied, already starting to close the door. But it did happen again, and again, each time with a new excuse. "The contractor's truck took my spot. My friend was just dropping off a casserole. It was just for a moment." Each time Margaret chose kindness, a note, a conversation, a breath. But slowly a feeling began to settle in, a quiet discomfort she couldn't quite shake. It wasn't about the driveway, not really. It was about the message, that her space didn't matter, that her home wasn't fully hers, that somehow her kindness made her invisible. And that realization, gentle as it came, was like a tiny crack in a window. At first barely noticeable, but over time, if ignored, even the smallest crack can shatter the glass. Margaret stood by her kitchen window one evening, watching the Lexus pull in once more, as if scripted. She sipped her tea, the ice long melted. For the first time, she didn't feel just annoyed. She felt disrespected. And deep inside, something shifted. She didn't know it yet, but that simple act, the fourth time the car invaded her driveway, would be the moment her story truly began. Blee Vanderholt wasn't elected to the HOA board. She had installed herself. At least that's what the neighbors joked in hushed tones. No one quite remembered when she took over, but she had been chairing meetings, sending newsletters, and issuing fines for aesthetic infractions for as long as anyone could remember. To some, she was organized. To others, obsessive. But to Margaret, she was simply tiring. Bull treated Oakview Estates like her personal kingdom, policing lawn heights, color palettes, even the number of seasonal wreaths allowed per front door. She smiled while doing it, of course. Blee always smiled. Her emails were always signed with warmly Blee, but they came with veiled threats. "We'd hate for your garden gnome collection to result in a community citation." She had power, not because she was particularly liked, but because most people didn't want to get on her bad side. And Bull knew that. So when Margaret kindly asked her not to park in the driveway, Bull didn't see it as a polite request. She saw it as a challenge. After all, in her mind, Margaret was just the wife. Yes, her husband had money. Yes, their house was one of the nicer ones. But Margaret? She wore gardening gloves and old cardigans. She waved too much. She baked muffins for strangers. Blee didn't fear Margaret, but perhaps that was her mistake. Because Margaret wasn't weak. She was measured, thoughtful, patient. And when patient people draw the line, they don't do it halfway. Blee, of course, didn't see it coming. She thought she'd parked in that driveway one too many times and gotten away with it, like always. But beneath Margaret's smile and southern politeness, something was beginning to take shape. A quiet, unwavering decision. And Blee? She was still too busy scanning for chipped paint and forgotten trash cans to notice that her rain had started to crack. Margaret had always believed that most problems could be solved with patience and pie. A calm tone, a gentle reminder, a warm loaf of banana bread left on a doorstep with a handwritten note. That was how she handled things. That was who she was. But even the kindest hearts have limits. The fourth time Blee's Lexus was in her driveway, it wasn't just inconvenient. It felt intentional. Margaret had just returned from picking up groceries. Her arms were full, The Florida heat was clinging to her like a second skin, and there it was again. That silver car, parked boldly in her space. No note, no apology, no effort to move. Margaret parked on the street and sat in the car for a long moment. Her hands stayed on the wheel, but her eyes were far away. It wasn't about the car anymore. Not really, it was about what it represented. Disregard, disrespect, dismissal. Blue's actions whispered a message Margaret couldn't ignore anymore. You don't matter. Not enough to be considered. Not enough to be heard. That night, Margaret stood in her kitchen, the light above the sink casting a soft golden hue over the countertops. The grocery bags sat untouched. The tea kettle whistled faintly, forgotten on the back burner. And she stood still, so still, just watching the Lexus through the blinds. Her heart wasn't racing. She wasn't angry, not in the way people throw plates or raise voices. No, this was something deeper, a kind of resolve that settles into the bones like a quiet storm. She picked up her phone, scrolled past her niece, her garden club friends, her husband's old golf buddy, and then she found the number she'd saved weeks ago. Not because she planned to use it, but just in case. Sunshine Towing. She dialed. Sunshine Towing, how can we help you? Margaret's voice was calm, almost soft. Yes, she said. I'd like to have a car removed from my private driveway. It's not authorized to be there. The dispatcher asked for her address, confirmed her ownership, said they'd be there within the hour. When she hung up, Margaret didn't feel triumphant. She didn't smile. She just breathed, a breath that felt like permission, permission to stop shrinking, to stop being accommodating at the expense of herself. It wasn't revenge. It was reclamation of space, of dignity, of peace. And as she stood on her front porch, arms crossed, watching the tow truck's lights blink against the soft evening sky, Margaret knew something had changed, not out there, in her. And sometimes that's where every revolution begins. The silence didn't last long. Less than an hour after the Lexus was towed, there came a pounding at Margaret's door. Not a knock, not a ring of the bell, but a full-on fist-to-wood assault, shaking the front panel like it had something to prove. Margaret took her time. She smoothed her blouse, sipped from a glass of iced tea, and slowly walked to the entryway. She already knew who it was. When she opened the door, there stood Bly Vanderholt, in silk pajama pants and a fury so hot it turned her face crimson. Her hair was undone, her phone clutched tightly in one trembling hand. "Where is my car?" she snapped, voice high and brittle. Margaret didn't flinch. She simply tilted her head. "Do you mean the car that was illegally parked in my driveway?" "Don't play games with me, Margaret. You had no right." "I had every right," Margaret said evenly. "I asked. You ignored. This is private property, and I acted within it." Blue's jaw clenched so tightly her earrings quivered. "I'm on the HOA board," she hissed. "I have connections. You're going to regret this." Margaret nodded slowly, as if absorbing a sad truth. "Your car is at Sunshine Towing on Orange Blossom Trail," she said, calm as a Sunday sermon. "They'll release it once you pay the impound fee." And with that, she gently closed the door. Blue's muffled screams echoed through the wood for several seconds, followed by the harsh clicking of her heels as she stomped down the walkway. But she wasn't done. 20 minutes later, 2 police officers showed up at Margaret's door. One tall, one younger, both looking more uncomfortable than stern. "Ma'am," the taller one began, "did you have a vehicle towed from your driveway earlier this evening?" "I did," Margaret replied, holding out a neatly folded property deed. "I own this home. It was not authorized to be there." He glanced at the paperwork, then nodded once. "You're within your rights." Bly stood across the street on her porch, arms folded, eyes glaring like a villain in a daytime soap. Margaret offered the officers a smile. "Would you like some lemonade before you go?" They declined politely and left. Bly didn't. That night, the neighborhood felt heavier. Not louder, just tense, like a storm had passed, but the clouds hadn't moved on. But inside Margaret's home, all was still. She wasn't celebrating. She wasn't angry. She was simply free. And that, more than anything, was worth every second of noise. For a moment, it seemed like Bull might back down. But women like Bly Vanderholt didn't retreat. They reloaded. 3 days after the tow, Margaret opened her front door to find a note taped to the glass in thick red marker, the kind used for garage sale signs or PTA bake sales. It read, "This is a community. We should be considerate of our neighbors. Passive-aggressive behavior is not the answer." It wasn't signed, but Margaret didn't need a signature to know who wrote it. She peeled it off calmly and tossed it in the trash. The next week, a letter arrived in the mail. It was from the HOA board, citing her potted ferns on the front porch as a violation of community aesthetic guidelines. Ferns that had sat in the same spot, quietly photosynthesizing, for over 2 years. Then came another letter. This time her trash bins had allegedly been left out too long on collection day. A third accused her of having chip paint on her mailbox. Margaret actually walked outside with a flashlight that night. The paint was fine, it was petty, it was transparent, but it was also, in a strange way, impressive. Blow was putting in real work, weaponizing the HOA handbook one citation at a time. And yet Margaret didn't flinch. She paid the fines, silently, kept records, photographed every plan and paint chip. She didn't complain, didn't escalate, just watched. Watched Blue exhaust herself with each petty strike. Watched neighbors start to murmur. Watched support begin to shift. Because what Blue failed to realize was this: when power is misused, it turns the light back on itself. And soon the neighborhood wasn't just watching Margaret, they were watching Bull. It started with a flyer, professionally printed, laminated, taped to every mailbox in Oakview Estates. Is this the kind of community we want? Do we tow our neighbors instead of talking to them? It didn't say Bull's name, but everyone knew. The design had that overly formal tone Bull favored, the kind of wording that tried to sound noble, but dripped with condescension. The flyer was supposed to turn the neighborhood against Margaret. It had the opposite effect. Margaret's phone lit up the next morning with messages from neighbors she barely knew. "Saw the flyer. What a joke. She fined me $100 for wind chimes last summer. If she parks in your driveway again, I'll help pay the tow fee." One neighbor even left a note in Margaret's mailbox that read, "Thank you for standing up. I've wanted to say something for years." Turns out Margaret wasn't the first person Bill had targeted. She was just the first one who didn't back down. There was Mrs. Jenkins, fined for her non-regulation flower pots. The Martins, who were reported for letting their teenage son play guitar on the porch. Even the Hendersons, who had been warned twice about a garden gnome that clashed with the overall tone of the neighborhood. Margaret had always suspected Bull's grip on the HOA was built more on fear than respect, but now that fear was starting to crack. The power Bull once held, quiet, unquestioned, was no longer invisible. Now it was exposed, and once exposed, it couldn't control the room the same way. Neighbors who had once waved politely and stayed out of things were suddenly chatting, comparing notes, realizing just how many of them had stories to tell, and none of them were flattering. The real shift came when the Jacobsons, usually the most neutral couple on the block, walked over one evening and brought Margaret a peach cobbler. Not because they were sorry, not because they were caught in the middle, but because, as Mr. Jacobson put it, "We just wanted you to know we're with you." Margaret smiled, thanked them, and invited them to sit for tea. She knew the battle wasn't over, but for the first time she also knew she wasn't alone. The monthly HOA meeting was usually a quiet affair. Half a dozen people scattered in folding chairs, sipping lukewarm coffee, nodding through landscaping updates, but not this time. That evening, the community center was packed. People who hadn't attended in years showed up early, murmuring in low tones, casting glances across the room. Margaret arrived a few minutes before it began. She wore a navy blue sweater, simple gold earrings, and the same calm expression she'd worn the day the Lexus was towed. She didn't bring notes. She didn't come to argue. She came to listen and to be heard. Across the room sat Blay Vanderholt, in her usual seat at the HOA table. Pale pink blazer, pearl necklace, her smile tight, eyes scanning the crowd like she was still in control. The meeting began with formalities, budget reports, mailbox maintenance, an update on the holiday lighting committee. Then the chair cleared his throat. "We have one final item on the agenda," he said, voice level. We've received multiple complaints from residents regarding misuse of HOA authority, targeted citations, and retaliatory behavior. The room went still. Blaze sat up straighter, clearly ready to respond. But then the chair added plainly, "These complaints are directed at board member Belle Vanderholt." Gasps, audible shock, and from some, quiet satisfaction. Belle opened her mouth, prepared to spin her version of events. But before she could speak, Mr. Hargrove, a retired Air Force veteran who'd lived in the neighborhood for 20 years, stood up. "No one's out to get you, Blee," he said. "We're just tired. Tired of the fines, the threats, the way you've turned this HOA into your own private stage." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Another neighbor chimed in. "I was written up for letting my daughter draw chalk art on the sidewalk. That wasn't community spirit. That was control." Bull tried to interrupt, but the board chair held up a hand. "We've reviewed the evidence, Blee. The flyers, the citations, the security calls. This isn't personal. It's a pattern." The room was quiet again. Then came the motion to vote on Blow's removal from the HOA board. One by one, the board members cast their votes. Unanimous. Blow Vanderholt was removed from her position, effective immediately. There was no applause, no cheers, just silence. Heavy, honest. And in that silence, Margaret leaned back slightly in her chair and exhaled. Blue didn't say a word as she gathered her purse and stood from the table. She didn't make eye contact, didn't offer an apology. Just the soft click of her heels echoing off the tile floor as she walked out of the community center, alone. Margaret didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She simply watched the door close and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: relief. In the weeks that followed, Oakview Estates began to feel different. The air was lighter. Conversations on the sidewalk lasted longer. Neighbors waved a little more, lingered at the mailbox a little longer. No more surprise citations. No more passive-aggressive notes. The silver Lexus never returned. 2 months later, a for sale sign appeared in front of Bull's home. By then, no one asked why. One sunny morning, as the moving trucks pulled away, Margaret stood on her porch with a cup of tea, watching the breeze dance through the lavender. There were no dramatic endings, no victory parade, just a quiet moment of stillness, and the sense that the neighborhood was finally breathing again. That afternoon, a young neighbor named Jenny stopped by. She carried a small box wrapped in yellow ribbon. "I made lemon bars," she said shyly. "Wanted to say thank you for everything." Margaret smiled, touched. "You didn't have to." Jenny shrugged. "Maybe not, but you reminded us all that we don't have to put up with what we know is wrong. You stood your ground, with grace. That mattered." As the sun dipped low, painting the houses in gold, Margaret sat back in her porch chair. The tea was warm, the world was quiet, and the driveway was finally hers. In a world that often feels rushed and loud, narrated stories like this one remind us of the quiet power in standing your ground with dignity. Margaret's journey isn't just a heartwarming story. It's a mirror held up to every person who's ever been overlooked, dismissed, or told to stay silent. Her courage shows that even small acts of resolve can ripple through a community, inspiring change where it's needed most. These touching stories speak to the soul, not with noise, but with meaning. And perhaps that's what makes incredible stories like hers so lasting. They're not about grand gestures, but about everyday people choosing integrity over convenience. So if you've ever felt like your voice didn't matter, remember Margaret, because sometimes the most powerful message isn't shouted, it's simply lived.